Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome again to the final part of our Zero Trust 101 webinar series with me, Nick Juckoop from Identity Methods, and again with Alan Fennick from Color Tokens, our Zero Trust partner. Our objective for this series from the outset was to firstly look at the recommended standards by NIST for achieving a Zero Trust architecture, and then go through the various building blocks that make up that foundation. So we've spoken about visualization, both north-south traffic and also east-west data traffic flows, because 80% of all traffic is internal, so it's monitoring that lateral movement. Then we went through segmentation last week. So that was all about segmenting cloud workloads, creating micro perimeters around important assets like the crown jewels and sensitive applications, so that we can enforce the zero trust concept of least privileged access and apply those policies. Now here we are at the final piece, which is about endpoint protection and lockdown. So how do we block zero-day or fileless exploits, and how do we stop communication to command and control servers that represents a threat? And how do we lock down any endpoint that's had an unauthorized process applied to that? We've said in previous sessions that the strength of a zero trust model is now moving away from the perimeter and closer to the resource. So what we're hoping to show you today is how we protect at the kernel level of the endpoint and prevent ransomware and malware to those resources. The key thing here today is all about prevention rather than detection and response. And as Alan goes through those concepts and a brief demo, if anyone's got any questions while he's running through that, please use the Q&A tab to your top left. And with that, I will now hand you over to Alan to run through lockdown. All yours, Alan.
Thank you, Nick, and welcome everyone to the final part of this series, and thank you for your attendance. So firstly, what I want to do is run through a recap again of why it's important to look at both not only your endpoints, but also your back-end infrastructure as an overarching security posture. So again, what we want to do here is look at making sure that we have the best level of granularity with zero downtime or interruption to your business. We need to be able to go through a process of first, as we described last week, visualizing what the access perimeter looks like within your infrastructure, but we equally need to be able to simulate any rule sets that we create. And the reason for all that purpose is effectively to make sure that we don't do any harm when we go about potentially restricting access to certain workloads or their capability. So we go through that and we monitor and simulate that for a period of time. For microsegmentation, this is typically a month to 3 months of visualization and understanding what flows are happening on your network. And equally for endpoints, what I'm going to describe today is how we can go about potentially restricting capability on endpoints, but not removing or diminishing the user's ability to do his or her job correctly. So once we go through that, we want to get to the point of locking down and enforcing those policies. And I'm going to show you today a little bit more how we can do that, not only from a server perspective, but mainly focused on the endpoint. As we've discussed before, the perimeter of security is moving. It's no longer people in an office necessarily. It's on untrusted networks out there at people's homes, coffee shops and cafes and so on. So it's a good principle for making sure that we can control, but not diminish the user experience. And it always comes back to the principle of effectively never trust and always verify. We do want to be able to trust our users to be sensible, but there are situations where sophisticated attacks, particularly from web browsers and so on, are very difficult for people to sometimes interpret, and they think they're doing a good action, but unfortunately it results in a breach of some description. So at a more technical level, we talked about locking down workloads, and last week we talked about microsegmentation. So there's a few control mechanisms that we use to achieve that. In a microsegmented environment, we typically want to leverage the native stateful firewall of the operating system. So in the Windows world, that's called the Windows filtering platform. For Linux, it's called IP tables. Most organizations haven't used the power of those tools because they're extremely difficult to manage at scale. But actually, if you go through having a tool that visualizes and allows you to program those firewalls, it becomes much, much more achievable to get you to that granularity point. Now, as we move on to endpoint, we described earlier, and Nick mentioned that we want to really go right very deep into the kernel of that particular operating system and use some form of control agent to go through a few mechanisms to help us understand how we can prevent processes or malicious file accesses from happening. And we can do that through a whitelist and blacklist policy, whereby we're going to allow certain things to happen, but we're going to block activities that that particular user doesn't necessarily need to do. So moving on from this, let's talk about the evolution of the endpoint security, how this all started. So 20 to 25 years ago, there were very basic antivirus programs out there that would look at particular known bad signatures, download those signature profiles to a particular agent that sits on your endpoint, and it would scan and try and capture any malicious processes that had happened. One of the drawbacks of this, it was actually very CPU intensive. So a lot of people shied away from having AV software on their machine because it ruined their user experience. But that's a very basic level of defense. Then it evolved into having a more reactive security model. So this is AV and endpoint detection. Now, these are recording everything that's happening on an endpoint. They're analyzing after the fact and basically saying, okay, we're going to try and stop things that are malicious spawning and processing. But these were very, very kind of network and data intensive. So they demanded a lot of resources potentially on that particular workload, which wasn't always optimal. The world we live in now is moving more towards a proactive security model, where we have EDR, plus we have various other control mechanisms. So we want to focus on basically prevention of something happening before that user was able to execute that task. And we only want to allow good things. We have to block everything else, but without diminishing that user experience. So we want it to be as light as possible on the network, and we want it to be as light as possible on the CPU. So that gives you an overview of kind of how things have evolved over the last 10 to 15 years within the endpoint space. I'd like to now take a look at what we do here at Color Tokens and the approach that we've taken using our product called XProtect. So from top down, we want to understand, a lightweight understanding of the threat intelligence. Where do we get those sources from? And how do we understand whether something is good or bad? And I'm going to talk you through how we do that. And we also want potentially, as an administrator, to be able to say, okay, we only want sanctioned applications to be able to run on our corporate assets, i.e. endpoint workloads. We don't want a user to particularly have freedom necessary to run absolutely everything they want. We don't want to kill their experience as a user, but we equally want to have some form of monitoring and control over what that particular user is allowed to do. We also want to be able to whitelist and blacklist those. We have a process or a section of this called rule rings. And what this does is it looks how a user could potentially spawn a process and whether that process is actually being spawned maliciously or whether it's valid or not. So these rule rings with a whitelist and blacklist policy allow us to start to look at potentially protecting that user environment from a malicious activity. So this could be ransomware, for instance. We have a feature called File Protect, which only allows files to be accessed from certain applications and stops potentially anyone using some form of command and control to maliciously either delete or modify files. We also look at things like device control. So many systems that are out there in the field have USB slots. What's stopping someone if you went to unattended, leave your laptop in a coffee shop by accident? Someone could come in potentially, use the USB ports to either delete files, extract files, or modify them in some behavior. So we look at that as a device control to stop those situations from happening. And equally from a network perspective, we want to make sure that any processes that are malware or bad don't exfiltrate across your network. So here's an example that I want to show you of, let's say we have a user that is using many applications. In this instance, we have PowerPoint, we have Chrome, we have PowerShell, we have WebEx, and we have Slack. We also know that actually we've got a process here called evil.exe, which shouldn't be running on that particular system. So what we firstly do is analyze exactly what processes in real time are running on the endpoint. Now, as we go through understanding those trust scores that we've talked about, we actually want to get to the point of basically saying, well, we know that evil.exe is actually not ever going to be valid. No one should be using that particular executable. And I'll talk through how we get to that trust score in the next section. So we've prevented basically that executable from running because it's known bad. But what we have done through a whitelist is make sure that all of the processes that endpoint is running are allowed. So basically, the whitelist concept is anything that we know is good, we put inside that whitelist. And by default, anything that isn't inside that whitelist is blocked. But we have some situations where, for instance, PowerShell shouldn't be allowed for that particular install, that particular endpoint. And we've explicitly said in that blacklist for that particular group that is blocked and will not be able to spawn. So effectively, if a user tries to spawn that particular process, it will just come up and say this is not available or access is denied. Now, equally, I want to talk a little bit about how processes are spawned, because there are many methods. For instance, if we want to use PowerShell, we could go to a command prompt, we could launch PowerShell from there. We could launch it from various different ways, and that process chain is very important. If we imagine a situation now where someone's using a web browser, they can do various different things like, spawn PowerShell from there through a command shell or any other access from a browser might not be a good way of spawning that process. It could be malicious. And through our rule ring section, we can basically say only processes that we allow, for instance, PowerShell.exe, can be spawned in a certain fashion. If they're launched from a different tree, which I'll show you later on, obviously that will get blocked. So I want to talk a bit about trust scores and what trust scores mean. So in essence, we aggregate data from a toolset called VirusTotal, which looks at all processes and looks at all types of downloads and accessible executables and understands the MD5 hash that is unique to those particular installations or programs. So that effectively, if the hash doesn't match once we do a check against it, we know that that's been manipulated. So it could be someone has gone and, with no malicious intent, to download something, let's say like Putty. They've got it from a different website, not the official one. And actually that executable's been modified and contains potentially malware or something that shouldn't be there. What we can do is use this database to understand exactly whether these are known good or known bad. And it's aggregated across over 40, I believe, antivirus vendors, all aggregated into the VirusTotal team. So we update that within our tool set periodically, refresh it to make sure that we have up-to-date data. What is FileProtect? Okay, so let's look at something where we have a policy that effectively says, okay, if we have users that have certain profiles of files like Word doc, Excel docs, and so on, they should only be able to be launched by a valid application. They shouldn't be able to be launched by any other mechanism. So what FileProtect does, it does a few things. It makes sure that you can only open those particular extensions via a permitted application. And this prevents things like command and control sets taking action where they might look at your file structure and try and do something like encrypt them. We also offer the ability to be able to encrypt using the native tool sets of the operating system, any nominated groups or files that we've specified in policy. And we just want to talk about, unregulated USB access. Now, I think this is fairly obvious, but in most circumstances, we want to be able to understand or at least monitor what has come in and out of a machine via that port. And this can cause various different issues for businesses' security posture if that access is allowed to be open on corporate assets. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we do that. And with that, I'd like to move on to a demo, and I'm going to show you in real time how XProtect works in action. So bear with me just whilst I launch the application. Okay, great. So the first screen that we see is effectively a dashboard. And this is a high-level view of where we've deployed the agent out into the field and how many of them are online or offline. Endpoints by nature are dynamic, so they are going to come on and offline depending on that user's profile, how their working hours. We're going to see them come up and down. But as we've deployed that agent, any policy that we've uploaded to it is persisted, and it's tamper-proof as well. So that particular user cannot actually uninstall this. It's all maintained and governed from this master dashboard. And we can do various things here. We can look at how many hosts are online, how many are offline, whether they need an update, and also what kind of threats have we seen across your whole estate. So we can see that we've seen some threats here of a high nature that may have been whitelisted or blocked. If we move through to the host section, this is effectively where you can view all of the assets in your inventory. And we support a magnitude of different operating systems. From a Windows level, we support from XP right up to the latest version, and Linux equally, most flavors, although not so popular on desktop, we also support. Equally, if you have Mac OS users in your estate, we can support the OS X operating system as well. What I want to do now is just briefly show you how we could start to go about creating policies. So we've got quite a few different policies outlined here, but I'm just going to pick one of these and edit it and understand exactly what is part of this particular policy. By default, you will see 3 or 4 different policies when you log into the system that will give you suggestions on rule sets based upon that particular whitelist download that we were talking about earlier from VirusTotal. But let's look and view and edit this policy. So what do we have here? So firstly, we can look at particular exploits. These are known bad. So Tor, for instance, we don't necessarily want people using Tor. We want to be able to block these because we know that they really shouldn't be using them for any business purpose. We also then can start to look at the policy settings from here. Now, this is where we can start to look at either monitoring or enforcing either whitelists or blacklists, or as I was talking about earlier, rule rings. Here we can enable or disable these features from a master level only for assets that are belonging to that particular group. We can also look at things here like file protect. So here we can specify which particular file sets and paths, more importantly, where they've been spawned from, to basically allow them to have access to those or not. And equally, if we do get into a situation where we've identified a malicious file, we have the ability to quarantine that file and put it into a specific quarantine folder on that particular machine where it can't be accessed or cause harm. That can equally be accessed and viewed from this master dashboard. So as an administrator, you can understand what that file has been doing and why it's been quarantined. As we go through to auto trust, if you're uncomfortable about understanding whether you want to whitelist or blacklist something, we have risk profiles here. So it could be low risk, medium risk, or high risk. And we could activate or pause these as necessary. And equally the behavior, do we want to just monitor this or do we want to block them? In most circumstances, we're basically going to say, okay, we understand that we're comfortable with any high risk applications being blocked, but medium to low risk, potentially we want to just monitor those for the time being until we're happy we've understood that for that group, we haven't impacted a user's capability. So from there, we can take a look at alerts as well. So let's give some examples here of a critical alert that we saw here. So we have something called userbroker.exe. Let's take a look at that. Okay. Now this was spawned through various different parts of a process tree. It used WinInit, it used services.exe, and then it was blocked because we appreciate that user broker or bbroker executable is not allowed in the whitelist. And the reason for that alert was it was blocked. It's not in that whitelist, so it's going to be stopped from processing. So that process tree, as you can see, goes through various components to eventually get to launching that process. And we're able, because we're in kernel mode, to block that in real time. So that's what I wanted to show everyone today. I'm going to hand back to Nick now, who's going to take some Q&A and equally summarize today's presentation. So over to you, Nick. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. So before I dive into the Q&A, I'm just going to sort of run through one or two questions for Alan. Then I'm going to do a very quick recap. And then I'm going to announce the winner of our Amazon £100 gift vouchers for attendance during the series. So please stand by for that. So with regards to the Q&A, again, if you want to post a question, use the Q&A tab on your top left, but I do have a couple for you now, Alan. So if I already have EDR or endpoint detection and response or traditional antivirus in place, would this replace it?
Well, in certain circumstances, it can replace and give you enough functionality. For instance, if you're running kiosks where you don't want to put antivirus software on, then that's fair enough. But it augments and goes on top of most EDR tools, such as Windows Defender or whatever EDR tool you have out there. So it's not a direct replacement. I would say it's more suited to augment and even improve over what you already have on your endpoints.
Okay, great. So an extra level layer of security. And in some cases where customers already have many agents sitting within their infrastructure, what impact would this have in terms of installing these agents?
Yeah, so from an impact level, it's minimal. So if you look at the average profile for running XProtect, for instance, in terms of memory space, it's around 10 to 20 megabytes of actual RAM space that it uses. So very, very minimal. CPU, typically we see 0 to 0.5% utilization. It doesn't actually really register upon on that endpoint as being anything intrusive or processor intrusive. Hopefully that answers that.
That does, yeah. And I think I've got a question here from John Lavendy. In which extent can your solution replace a network firewall? It's a good question.
Yeah, so what we typically say is you have perimeter firewalls naturally that are protecting you from the outside world or internet facing coming in. With microsegmentation, depending on the size of your estate, you may have had to put east-west firewalls in or ACLs or something, layer 3 VLAN based. So we are able to remove the necessity to have east-west firewalls. But what we wouldn't, replace is effectively your perimeter firewalls because they're still doing a job. Microsegmentation is about, securing internal traffic more so than it is external.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for that, Alan, and hopefully that answers John's question. So just to recap then, we covered endpoint protection and lockdown using an ultralight control agent, using whitelists and blacklists, giving you the ability to monitor and block malicious processes, files, and unauthorized access. So this is moving towards a more proactive security model with a focus on prevention. So I just wanted to announce the winner of our £100 Amazon gift voucher, which is Mark Gardner. Congratulations, Mark. We'll be in touch shortly around that. But I want to thank everyone for attending these sessions, which were presented to you by Color Tokens, which is a cloud-based zero trust solution, giving you 360-degree visualization, segmentation of cloud workloads, applications, and servers, and finally, endpoint protection and lockdown that we've covered today. We hope you found these sessions useful, and please, if anyone wants to talk to us more about their zero trust initiatives, we're happy to help and support you through your zero trust journey. And obviously, if anyone wants to see a full demo, because we were restricted to the 20-minute time slot that we have, then please contact me. We will be in touch with all of you in due course. But until then, on behalf of Alan and myself, thank you and enjoy the weekend.